some lawmakers saw this tax as a way to force the court to revisit that 1933 precedent that has banned an income tax in Washington. As a former justice, what is your reaction to that strategy? Is it legit or does it cross the line?
Well, I think it's going to be troubling to the court. The court doesn't like to have its hand forced in any particular way. So that's going to be an issue that's going to be significant for the court. But I think the larger issue to look at here is, for the proponents of the legislation to talk about this as a millionaire's tax now rings rather hollow. I mean, it becomes very clear that this isn't a tax directed at millionaires. It's a tax directed at everybody in the state of Washington. And not to be lost sight of, this isn't really overall tax reform. What we're talking about is simply more revenue in this particular bill. We're not talking about any particular tax changes that would make the tax system overall fairer. We're not talking about major changes in the sales tax, major changes in the property tax. Rather, we're just talking about more revenue in this particular piece of legislation that was enacted by the legislature.
In this case, sir, you are a Democrat suing Democratic lawmakers over the Democratic governor's signature. When you look at the party's leadership right now, what do they get wrong about how they actually build lasting tax reform in this state?
Well, not to be lost sight of, I served in the legislature for 16 years, and then I was on the Supreme Court. I wasn't a Democrat on the Supreme Court. I was a justice of the Washington Supreme Court. Okay. So I haven't been a partisan for a fairly long time. And in this particular circumstance, I'm representing my clients. I'm representing the Ethnic Chamber of Commerce Coalition that's concerned about the tax. So just by way of background, Gee, that's where I'm at.
Okay.
Where I see this being problematic, putting on my former legislator hat for a moment, what we tried to do some years ago was do comprehensive tax reform, put it in the Constitution. This was in the 1983 session of the legislature. We're getting in the Wayback Machine to talk about this a bit. But in that particular proposal, there was an income tax. I'm not opposed to an income tax per se, but as part of that proposal built into the state constitution, we reduced the sales tax. We reduced property taxes. We made the overall tax system, simply fairer for everybody concerned. Again, as I pointed out a bit ago, this particular proposal that's before us, that's going to be challenged in court and has been the subject of our complaint, is a measure that increases revenue dramatically. It doesn't create overall tax reform in any particular way. Income taxes can be part of overall tax reform, but we have a very high sales tax. We have a very high property tax. And to add on to that, an income tax to boot, that's problematic, I think, for most Washingtonians. And that's the issue that the Supreme Court's going to grapple with.
You're listening to former State Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge here on the Gee Ursula Show. So help us understand that 1933 ruling that keeps getting brought up. Why has Washington treated income as property, and how solid is that precedent?
Well, our state constitution is really clear. It says you have to treat all classes of property the same. So if you tax property at 1%, you tax income as property too, because the court determined that income was property. And that's the genesis for this. There's this uniformity clause in the state constitution that applies. What it means, by the way, is you could pass an income tax, a 1% income tax on everybody, for example, and it wouldn't offend the Constitution. But you can't do a graduated net income tax the way the legislature proposed to do it. And what happened was in 1932, the people of the state of Washington passed an initiative to impose a graduated net income tax. It was challenged in court, and the Supreme Court said, nope, can't do it. Legislature came back the next session of the legislature and said, oh, we're going to have an excise tax on property, and it's going to be graduated. And the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, we didn't fall off the turnip truck last week. That's an income tax. We told you before that's something you can't do. You can't do it. So you have those two decisions from the early 1930s saying this isn't possible. And it's been the law in Washington since the early 1930s. We're talking about now nearly a century of precedent in Washington, case after case after case, where this issue has come up saying graduated net income tax, can't do it. If you want to do a 1% across the board income tax, yeah, you can do it. But that's not what the legislature did here. What they're hoping to do is force the hand of the Supreme Court to change the law, as now these documents that you've referred to, make clear.
Going back to that 1983 constitutional amendment that you just brought up here a second ago, and that's one you mentioned, and you talked about the proposal that would have cut sales tax, cut property taxes, and everything. Now, the voters still said no to that eventually, right?
Actually, we didn't get it passed.
Okay.
There were some efforts made in the 70s that did get on the ballot, and the voters turned it down. The voters have never been enthusiastic about an income tax in Washington. They've never voted for one. We just haven't seen it happen.
I got to say, and the reason why I'm bringing that up, because when you brought that up, I think that is a good one, actually. And it feels like that would probably be the closest that, if put on the ballot, that the people would actually say, okay, we can deal with that. But it sounds like no matter what, anything income tax is a no-go in this state. Your thoughts?
Gee, it almost seems like, the income tax is like the third rail of Washington politics. Touch it, you die. It's like, from a political standpoint. The thing that was interesting about that income tax proposal was the reform proposal in the early 80s was that it did have a multiplicity of efforts to reduce taxes, and not to be lost sight of. For the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment, it had to be a 2/3 vote. It had to be a bipartisan effort. It was not an easy political lift to get to 2/3 of the House and the Senate and then the people to vote on it. But it was, as you say, I think the closest thing to a kind of a fair approach to the issue that could be crafted. And even at that, it didn't finally pass muster in the early 80s. And the efforts made by Dan Evans in the 70s to do something similar in the way of tax reform did get to the ballot and failed miserably.
So while all this is happening and there's lawsuits now about this millionaire's tax, at the same time, we have 5 Supreme Court races on the ballot, something that I don't know that we've ever seen that. How significant is that?
It's very significant. And, it's an opportunity for me to do a little commercial here. And that is, people should take voting for judges seriously. Oftentimes you go to the ballot and you get down to the bottom of the ballot and you go, gee, I don't know who the hell these people are. I'm not going to vote for them. What do I know about this? This is one of those times where this is really significant. People on the Supreme Court make really fundamental decisions, not only about income taxes, about criminal justice, about civil liability, about commercial law, about all sorts of stuff that's really important. Really fundamentally important to the people of the state, and they ought to pay attention to their vote for the Supreme Court. And they're going to have an opportunity to pay serious attention to some significant races for the Supreme Court. Some really well-qualified candidates are running for all of these seats. Some incumbents are seeking to stay on the court. It's really important that people pay attention to this and look at those people very carefully and read their voters pamphlet. The voters pamphlet is a great tool to get a good idea, at least initially, about what these people are all about.
And just to that end as well, because you're talking about this lawsuit that could be heard by an entirely new court.
More likely will be heard by that entirely new court, I think. Just by the nature of the time it takes to, you got to go to the trial court, the trial, briefing, the trial judge can make a decision. You appeal, you do the briefing, get to the court. By the time things roll around, I think it's going to be very unlikely that anything other than the new court that's going to be decided this fall will be sitting on this case. So that's why I say it's really fundamental. Those positions you're talking about, Ursula, are going to be the ones, those people are going to be the ones that are likely going to hear this challenge.
Before we wrap this up, our colleague, KIRO News reporter Luke Ducey came in here and he set it up and he was talking about it. And one of the words that he said, and I get caught up on words, and you actually said the word too, is forced, right? Mm-hmm. So that word came up, and Senator J.B. Peterson, they actually put it in writing. And the quote was, force the Washington Supreme Court to reconsider. We're talking about a 99-year ruling. So you, as being a former justice and everything like that, how does that shape the integrity going forward?
Sometimes, challenges are set up so that it's ultimately going to go to the court, but it isn't quite as blatant as this, where you put it down in writing and say, we're going to force your hand, kids. How do you like that? The justices of the Supreme Court are highly independent, very capable people. They've run statewide. They're trained in the law. They don't like to be forced into doing anything. They are, they've pride themselves on their independence. They're a separate branch of government from the legislature and the governor, and they pride themselves on that independence. I did as a justice, and I think it's a part and parcel of our system that you want that independent look. And when you're sitting there in the temple of justice and you think these other branches of government are trying to force your hand, it's not taken kindly.
Okay, we have 1 minute, Justice Talmadge, and I want to get back to this 1933 ruling. If the court were to reverse that, be very specific. What opens up?
If the court decides to change the definition of income as property, what that means is there's no limitation on the ability of the legislature to impose an income tax on every single individual in the state of Washington. So bottom line, this notion that it's, quote, a millionaire's tax is a misnomer, because they've made it very clear that it's not. This is meant to be a test case. If they're correct in their position, then anything can be taxed as in a graduated net income tax. No millionaire tax. It can go down to just about any and all of us.